The escape from Alcatraz is America's most notorious cold case. It took place on June 11th, 1962. It involved Franklin Morris, Clarence and John Anglin, and Franklin Morris, who's pictured here, is largely alleged to be the mastermind. He had a very high IQ, and he was a career criminal. He had a history of successful escapes. The escape was quite ingenious. It took 6 months to plan. It involved the inmates making false ventilator shafts, and they removed the original ones and they put the false ones on. This allowed them to go into the utility corridor. From there, they accessed the second floor, and on the second floor, they had a workstation. The workstation was covered by blankets because another inmate was working up there, and to prevent dust from falling down to the first floor, blankets were hung up. And the inmates had access to raincoats, which they accessed themselves, or other inmates forwarded to them clandestinely. And they actually ordered an accordion through the mail to inflate the raft that they were gonna make. They also made makeshift paddles and dummy heads to put in their beds at night, and they also made a raft up there with the raincoats, and they had a 14-foot raft, and they used as a blueprint Sports Illustrated magazine that was in their library, incredibly. At Alcatraz, which they had access to. A fourth inmate was in on the escape. He could not break out the night of the escape through the ventilator shaft. A bar blocked it, and he had to stay behind. Okay, it wasn't until 7 a.m. the following morning that that they were noticed they were missing, so they had about an 8-hour head start. Some papers in plastic and a wallet were found in the water during the extensive search. Also some raincoat material. And there's been some unconfirmed reports that parts of the raft were found, but they probably just found raincoat. There have been different reports on that. But no bodies were found at all. None were found. Now, a Norwegian ship 5 weeks later said they saw a body floating in the water, and they couldn't maneuver the ship to retrieve it. And it was dressed like an inmate would be on Alcatraz, but it's unclear if it was one of the inmates that escaped. That's never been verified. The prison closed shortly after that. It was just too costly to maintain. Bobby Kennedy determined that it cost too much to run the place, being isolated like that. Everything they had to do, they had to ship to and from. And the search for the inmates has been extensive, exhaustive, and existed in a perennial capacity. The leads have been present, but they haven't been actionable, and they have like zero substance. In fact, the only real lead they had is in 1965. Somebody said one of the Anglin brothers was in Brazil, and he was trying to acquire identification. Agents were dispatched, law enforcement agents, but they could not locate him. Now, whether or not they made or not or drowned in the bay is definitely a good question. The family said that postcards and Christmas cards arrived in the mail years after, 2 or 3 years later, and they were signed by Clarence and John Anglin. And the case was also covered by Inside Edition. In 1989, somebody said the Anglin brothers were seen at a bar in Brazil, and that was looked into by law enforcement, and it did not pan out. And it wasn't till just recently the History Channel did a show, and the families of the Anglin brothers brought a picture of 2 men in Brazil, and they're trying to showed him to the person who was handling the investigation, Art Roderick, who had retired, and he was obsessed with the case for 20 years, and he said there was no actionable leads, and they determined through computer software the 2 men in the picture, which were taken in 1975 on a farm in Brazil, probably were the escapees. It wasn't foolproof. It wasn't foolproof, though. It was highly probable. And there's also been a recent letter that's written to law enforcement. They're trying to determine if that was from one of the inmates. And then, if you ever watch documentaries on this, they're plentiful. TV shows, it's books. They're quite plentiful, and they don't really answer whether or not they made it or not. In fact, 1979, the most movie was made by the famous actor Clint Eastwood. It was about the escape from Alcatraz. So, it's quite an escape without real answers. And let's see, I can tell you a little more about Alcatraz here. When Alcatraz first became a prison, inmates were not allowed to talk to each other, unless they had to do it for work. They had to have complete silence. But as the years went by, that was lessened a bit. Instead of old-fashioned key locks, Alcatraz prison had a modern mechanical locking system that was the staff could close and operate all the cells simultaneously, and that's the genesis for the word slammer. As the door would close, it would slam close in all the cells. Here's one image from Alcatraz, Machine Gun Kelly, and he's one of the more famous inmates there. And the food on Alcatraz was quite good. There were inmates that actually wanted to transfer to Alcatraz from other prisons because it was a safer environment. Also, the food was quite good. It's an unusual assessment of a prison like that. Inmates were told that sharks inhabited the San Francisco Bay. Sharks could be found in the bay, but there's only one documented fatality, and it took place in 1959. The alleged mastermind of the escape, Franklin Morris, he was arrested in 1955 for bank robbery and forwarded to a prison, and from there forwarded to Alcatraz. And him and two other robbers tried to rob a bank, and the gas leak that they had not anticipated exploded on them, and they were all caught. And here's a card on Franklin Morris offering information about his status in prison and stuff like that. He's quite an enigma in this case. Nobody knows whatever happened to him. And in Alcatraz prison, the inmates had a system of smuggling contraband. If it was smuggled to the laundry room, they could hide in the sheets, and then from there they could deliver to the cells. The sheets in the laundry room were never searched. Exactly how many other inmates knew about the escape remains unclear. Okay, but some believe up to 80 inmates may have known or even helped in the escape plan. And here's a picture of the dummy heads that were used. And despite everything, FBI boss Jack Hoover was frustrated by the escape and wanted him captured at any cost. But although they weren't sure they survived, this is a case where the FBI just could not get their escapees. And Al Capone was at Alcatraz for a while. You can see him in silhouette over there, and he was head of the mafia. And there's Art Roderick. He's one that handled the investigation in later years, and he was actually infatuated with it and said there was never one lead that they considered to be viable. And Alcatraz was really brought about by the crime wave in the early part of the century, but in the 20s and 30s. It just got so out of control, so they had to build Alcatraz to forward these criminals to that location. And here's a picture of John Dillinger. He almost personified crime in that era. And here's an old movie poster from that era. And toughest gangsters of America's most violent era. This open movie poster displays the atmosphere of the 20s and 30s in America, and it's Alcatraz was Uncle Sam's answer to accommodate the country's most prominent underworld figures. And here's a remote farm in Brazil, and this offers opportunity for the inmates to just disappear from law enforcement for years, if they hopefully get that visible there. And here's the ventilating shaft that was an avenue for the inmates to escape into the utility quarter. From there, they went to the second floor and the location they had for a workstation. So it's quite an ingenious escape. It's really not verified and not determined fully if they beat the rock. It's with some of the new information that's come about, presented on the documentaries on television. It's believed the Clarence and John Anglin somehow made it to Brazil and were photographed in 1975 by an old friend of theirs, and it's highly probable it's them. That doesn't answer the question, what happened to Frank Lee Morris, who's quite an enigma in this case, largely rumored to be the mastermind with a high IQ and stuff like that. His location is just totally unknown, or if he even survived the escape. And like I said, it's quite a cold case here, something that defines itself without answers. It is just that, an unsolved mystery. Okay, I think that should, see if I can, that should discover things. If I can get some, and hopefully everything uploaded okay, and the pictures were visible. Let's see if I can get some, old music here to finalize the. Like I said, if you ever are watching TV and you want to know more about this case, hopefully this brief introduction helped you to grasp some of the variables. And then, like I said, it already is just that, an unsolved case. And tips actually still float in, and it doesn't really look as though they're actionable outside of the ones with Frank and Clarence and John Anglin being in the picture. And here's some final music, and hopefully everything upload okay and everything will be okay. And one moment here. And again, there's several books on Amazon that are available for Kindle readers, as well as in paperback. You can order those. And let's see.